The rule at Goli Otok was simple, and the officers who ran it were not shy about saying it out loud. A prisoner who wanted a lighter sentence proved it by breaking the next one who arrived. No guard needed to lay a hand on anybody. The men already on the island did that in a line on the dock within minutes of the boat touching land. Between 1949 and 1956, something close to 13,000 people were sent through that system. For most of them, the first blow on Goli Otok came from someone wearing the same striped uniform they did. Nobody had to write a manual for that. It ran on its own. This is the story of an island built to punish men who trusted the wrong country and then handed the punishing over to the men themselves. This is Goli Otok. By 1948, Yugoslavia had a problem that did not look like a problem to anyone watching from outside. Josip Broz Tito ran a communist state, allied in theory with Moscow, subject in theory to the same ideological line as every other communist party in Europe. Then, in June of that year, the Cominform, the body that coordinated those parties, expelled Yugoslavia from its ranks. Tito had refused to take orders from Moscow on how to run his own country. Stalin expected the Yugoslav Communist Party to fall apart under the pressure or to remove Tito and fall back in line. Neither happened. Tito kept power. What happened instead was a purge aimed inward, at the people inside his own party who had sided with Stalin instead of him. That purge did not run through a courtroom. None of this made Yugoslavia an enemy of the West. The opposite happened. Within a few years of the break, the United States and its allies began sending economic and military aid to a communist government they would not have supported anywhere else in Europe simply because a communist state at odds with Moscow was, to Washington, worth keeping upright. Tito used that leverage to help found the non-aligned movement, officially loyal to neither Cold War bloc. The island built to punish men for staying loyal to Moscow opened in the same stretch of years that turned Yugoslavia into the one communist country most useful for the United States to have on speaking terms with. On paper, Yugoslavia had judges, prosecutors, and a criminal code, the same as any state that called itself a republic. In practice, the people swept up after the Cominform. Resolutions were processed by party commissions, not courts. A commission reviewed a name, assigned a term of what the paperwork called corrective labor, and stamped the file. Nobody stood up to argue the other side because there was no proceeding for anyone to argue in. Across the country, something close to 16,000 people were investigated on suspicion of Cominformist sympathy between 1948 and 1956. Most of them had never organized against Tito in any way that resembled a plot. A number of them had done nothing more specific than keeping a photograph of Stalin on a shelf, subscribing to a Soviet newspaper, or answering a question about the resolution in a way that did not sound careful enough. Here's the part that catches people out. Yugoslavia never called this a prison sentence. The official language was socially useful labor, and later, re-education. Free is doing a lot of work in that second word. A man sent to Goli Otok under that heading was not, on his own paperwork, being punished. He was being corrected, the way a piece of machinery gets adjusted, and the paperwork read exactly that way. Word of the island did not spread through newspapers because Yugoslav newspapers did not print anything about it. What spread instead was a quieter kind of knowledge, a name people stopped saying out loud, a chair at a workplace that someone else eventually filled. Exactly how many families understood what had happened to a missing relative is not something any surviving record answers. What the record does confirm is that nobody was required to explain it to them. The target list did not stay narrow for long. Cominformists were the reason the island opened, but they were never the only people sent there. In the years that followed, the same system held Communist Party members merely suspected of Soviet sympathy, and alongside them, Serbian, Croatian, Macedonian, and Albanian nationalists who had no loyalty to Moscow at all and would have been horrified to be filed next to a Stalinist. The one thing a file required was a category. It did not require a crime with evidence behind it. The ethnic makeup of that 16,000 did not track a simple story about one nationality punishing another. Historians working from the surviving administrative records describe the largest single group as just under half of those investigated, with the rest split across Montenegrins, Croats, and smaller numbers of Macedonians, Bulgarians, and Albanians. Whatever this purge was, it was not one national group settling a grudge against another. It ran through every part of the federation Tito governed, roughly in proportion to how many committed communists lived in each of those places to begin with. 2 men are named in the surviving record as shaping how the isolation itself would work. Edvard Kardelj, second only to Tito in the party hierarchy, is credited with the idea at the center of the plan: take the West. Cominformists somewhere the rest of the country could not see them, and let distance do the work that persuasion had failed to do. Aleksandar Ranković, the interior minister and head of the secret police, the UDBA, built the machine that carried the idea out: the arrests, the files, the transport, the guards. That was the division of labor. Between the two of them, a decision made in an office in Belgrade turned into a boat leaving a dock on the Adriatic coast. Neither man ever had to stand where that boat landed. The location itself was picked for reasons that had nothing to do with correcting anybody. Yugoslav authorities needed somewhere isolated enough that word of what happened there would not travel easily, and remote enough that no foreign journalist or curious relative could reach it by accident. An island in the northern Adriatic answered both requirements: 4.5 square kilometers of bare limestone, no fresh water, almost no trees, and a wind in winter strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet. It already had a name. Yugoslavia kept it: Goli Otok, Barren Island. Among the people swept up in this purge was Vlado Dapčević, a lieutenant colonel who had fought as a partisan against the wartime occupation and had earned by 1948 a level of trust inside the Communist Party that put him well above most of the men who would eventually judge him. He was also the younger brother of Vlado Dapčević, one of the most decorated Yugoslav military commanders of the war, a detail that would matter more later than it did the day he was arrested. Vlado chose the Cominform side of the split. He was caught in the fall of 1948 trying to leave the country. 22 months in pretrial custody followed before a party tribunal. Handed down its answer: 20 years. He was not the most senior man swept up that year, and he would not be the last person arrested in this story. What set his file apart was not the length of the sentence, it was how long it would stay open. Nobody writing that number down in 1950 could have known it would still be relevant to Dapčević's life in 1975. The tribunal that reviewed his case did not need to prove anything a defense lawyer could contest, because a defense lawyer was never part of the process. That was the rule, and it applied to a lieutenant colonel exactly as it applied to a shopkeeper who had said something careless at a bar. Somebody sat down and wrote that sentence. Then he went to lunch. The men who built Goli Otok were the same men who would later be imprisoned inside it. The first transport arrived in July 1949. A small group of prisoners landed first, followed within days by roughly 1,200 more. There was no camp waiting for them. There was an island, a scattering of tents, and a work order. The first task was to quarry the island's own limestone and turn it into the walls, barracks, and fences that would hold the next boatload, and the boatload after that. On paper, this was construction work like any other. In practice, every plank a man nailed into place narrowed his own room to move, and everybody on the island understood the arrangement without being told twice. By the time the camp reached its full size, it operated as 4 separate sections, built in stages rather than all at once. The first, known among the prisoners as the Old Wire, held the earliest arrivals from 1949. A second and much larger section, the Great Wire, expanded the camp through the early 1950s as the numbers grew. A smaller section held women prisoners for roughly a year before that population was moved to a camp of its own on a neighboring island. And one section stood apart from the rest entirely: Petrova Rupa, Peter's Pit, a set of isolation cells reserved for the highest-ranking Cominformists and for anyone the camp administration judged too resistant to place among the general population. It operated for about 4 years before it was torn down. Here's the part that is easy to miss if you only picture a single building. Goli Otok was never one prison. It was a small system of camps stacked on one barren island, and the physical separation between them mattered as much as the fences around each. Each section was ringed by barbed wire roughly 3 meters high, watched from guard towers and lit at night. Inside, prisoners slept on wooden bunks stacked 3 levels, in barracks with a shared latrine, an open pit with planks laid across it, at one end. There was no natural water source on the island capable of supporting the population housed there. Rainwater was collected in tanks, and the rest arrived by boat from the mainland, which meant that even drinking water depended on a supply line. The camp. Administration controlled completely. The climate did the rest of the work that walls could not. Summer temperatures on the exposed limestone climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, with almost no shade anywhere on the island. Winter brought the Bora, a wind that funnels down off the Velebit Mountains on the mainland and across the narrow channel at speeds that can exceed 150 kilometers an hour. A man could be knocked off his feet simply crossing open ground between two buildings. Nobody needed to design that as a punishment. The island did it on its own, every year, on schedule. The men who decided how all of this would be organized were, for the most part, nowhere near it. Jovo Kapicic, a general in the UDBA, is named in the surviving record as one of the officials who structured the camp's internal administration. The hierarchy of barracks elders, work foremen, and camp activists who ran daily life on the ground, all of it under guard supervision, but much of it day to day in the hands of the prisoners themselves. The instructions for how that hierarchy should function came from offices in Belgrade and Zagreb. The men receiving the instructions on the ground answered to superiors who had never spent a night on the island and never would. Nobody who structured that hierarchy from an office on the mainland ever had to stand in the yard during a January Bora to see what the order looked like once it reached the ground. The distance between the two was not a gap in the system. It was built into it, the same way the barbed wire and the guard towers were. Labor went beyond building the camp itself. Prisoners worked stone quarries that produced building material shipped back to the mainland, along with workshops for furniture making, joinery, and small-scale manufacturing that generated income for the security apparatus running the island. A camp built to isolate men from the rest of Yugoslavia also, quietly, paid for part of its own operation. The stone the prisoners cut did not stay on Goli Otok. It went out on the same boats that had brought the prisoners in, and it built things on the mainland that most of the men who quarried it would never see. The work itself branched out over the years. Beyond the quarry, prisoners cut tile and terrazzo slabs, built furniture, repaired boats, mended fishing nets, made shoes, and produced sand for construction elsewhere in the country. A library was added later, and so was a football pitch, additions that sit oddly next to everything already described. Both were real. Walk the island the way a new prisoner would have, and the layout tells its own story before anyone says a word. From the dock, a narrow path led up to the main gate, watched from a tower on either side. Past the gate stood the administration building, where files were kept and orders came down, close enough to the entrance that it was usually the first structure a new arrival saw clearly. Beyond that lay the barracks, row after row of them, and beyond the barracks, the quarry face itself, cut deeper into the hillside with each passing year. The infirmary sat off to one side, small and, by every surviving account, chronically short of anything resembling medicine. Last of all, past the working part of the camp entirely, was the cemetery. Unmarked graves on a slope facing the sea, visible from parts of the quarry on a clear day, close enough that a man breaking stone could look up and see exactly where the path from the dock eventually ended for some of the people who had walked it before him. The island maintained two separate working harbors during the years the camp operated. One for prisoner transports, kept apart from a second used for supply boats. It is a small detail, but it says something on its own. A supposedly empty island had to support enough infrastructure to feed, guard, and eventually bury 13,000 people. And none of that infrastructure was an accident either. A channel like this one walks through a different island or colony roughly every few days. If the story of Goli Otok is worth staying for, following the channel is the easiest way to catch the next one. By 1950, the buildings were largely finished. The men who would fill them for the next 6 years were already arriving in numbers the original tents could never have held. The first thing a new arrival learned about Goli Otok, he learned before he reached the gate. As the boat came in, prisoners already on the island lined the route from the dock inward. The Špalir, a name that translates roughly to the gauntlet. And as each new man walked or was pushed through it, the line shouted insults and slogans, spat at him, and struck him often with sticks or fists, sometimes with whatever else was in reach. Guards stood by and let it happen. They rarely needed to join in. The violence a new prisoner met in his first minutes on the island came almost entirely from other prisoners, and the camp did not treat that as a breakdown of order. It was the order. The rule behind the gauntlet had a name too: the boycott. A prisoner accused of remaining loyal to Stalin, or simply judged insufficiently repentant, could be placed under boycott by the camp's own internal hierarchy, a structure of barracks elders, work foremen, and cultural political leaders drawn from the prisoner population itself, operating under guard supervision, but running most of daily life without direct guard involvement at all. Once a man was placed under boycott, the men around him stopped speaking to him. They would not share a cigarette with him. His food ration shrank. He stood while everyone else sat. He was woken at night for no stated reason and made to answer questions that had no correct answer. He might be marked a red stripe, a black shirt, so that any prisoner who wanted to prove loyalty could beat him without needing an excuse. He was assigned the worst labor on the island, which on Goli Otok generally meant the latrines. Some survivor accounts describe methods that went further still: prolonged standing in direct sun without shade, heavy objects placed on a man's chest while he lay on the ground, near drowning during questioning. These are harder to verify against a single administrative record than the boycott itself, which the camp's own organizational structure confirms simply by how it was set up on paper. What is certain is the boycott. What individual guards or prisoner enforcers did beyond it varied by section, by year, and by who happened to be running a given barracks that month. It is worth saying plainly what that meant for the men on the ground. A prisoner did not have to be ordered to inform on his barracks mate. He had every practical incentive to do it himself, because refusing was its own kind of confession. The system did not need to convince anyone that betrayal was virtuous. It only needed to make the alternative to betrayal cost more than most men were willing to pay. A day on the island for a prisoner in reasonable standing followed a shape that barely varied: roll call before dawn. In whatever weather the season provided, standing in rows until a guard was satisfied every face could be accounted for. Then the quarry, or the workshop, or whichever labor detail had been assigned that week, for 8 to 12 hours depending on the season and the work. A midday ration that nobody on the island would have called generous. More labor. A second roll call. Barracks. Bunks stacked 3 high. The latrine at the far end, and whatever conversation the boycott system had not made too dangerous to attempt. Then the next morning, the same shape again, for as long as the sentence said it should continue. None of this reached the public at the time. It would take decades and a change in what Yugoslavia was willing to publish before anyone described the boycott system in this much detail outside the island itself. The writer Dragoslav Mihailovic, interned at Goli Otok himself in 1950 as a young man, later spent 5 volumes and dozens of interviews collecting testimony from other survivors, piecing together how the hierarchy of barracks elders and boycotted men had actually worked. His first attempt at the subject, a novel published in 1968, was banned within months. The mechanism had operated for years in near total silence. It took considerably longer for anyone to describe it out loud. Not every man who lived through that shape was there for the reason the camp officially claimed. Shaban Bajramovic, a Romani teenager from southern Serbia, was sent to Goli Otok at 19 for deserting his military service. A personal matter, not a political one, and a 3-year sentence rather than the open-ended terms handed to Cominform. Inside the camp, he found his way onto the prisoner football team as a goalkeeper, quick enough that other inmates nicknamed him the Black Panther for it, and talked his way into the camp's small prisoner orchestra, where he learned to sing standards by Louis Armstrong and Frank Sinatra alongside Spanish and Mexican numbers nobody on that island had any obvious reason to know. He would go on after his release to become one of the most recognized Romani singers Yugoslavia ever produced. None of that erased what the boycott system did to the men around him. It simply meant that even inside a machine built, for one purpose, individual lives ran on their own logic that the machine could not fully control. He was one man. There were, by the camp's own numbers, close to 13,000 more behind him. Before any of this, Vlado Dapčević had been the kind of man the Yugoslav Communist Party pointed to with pride. Born in Montenegro in 1917, he joined the party as a teenager and fought as a partisan through the occupation years. He was not the only Dapčević brother to make a name for himself in that war. His older brother, Peko Dapčević, commanded partisan corps and armies and would go on to be counted among the most decorated Yugoslav military leaders of the entire conflict. By the time Tito split from Stalin in 1948, the Dapčević name carried weight inside the party. Vlado had every reason to expect his own record would protect him. It did not. He chose Stalin's side of the split. To Dapčević, the Cominform resolution was not a foreign attack to be resisted. It was a call back to a version of international communism. He believed in more than he believed in Tito's independent path, and he said so plainly enough that it reached the wrong ears. In the fall of 1948, he was caught trying to leave the country. 22 months passed in pretrial custody before a party tribunal delivered its answer. 20 years. From June 1950 until the 6th of December 1956, he was held across 3 camps: Stara Gradiška and Bileća on the mainland, and Goli Otok, where he spent the bulk of that stretch. What happened to him there is documented largely in his own account, given decades later, once Yugoslavia allowed the subject to be discussed at all. He described teeth broken, his tongue cut, his throat torn, his ribs broken, treatment aimed at making him renounce the Cominform position and confess to whatever the camp administration wanted, confessed. He maintained in that same later account that he never gave up his political views, whatever was done to make him. That distinction is worth sitting with for a moment. The boycott system on Goli Otok existed to convert resistance into cooperation, to make a man perform loyalty convincingly enough that the hierarchy would ease off him and move to someone else. Most men eventually performed it because the alternative kept getting worse. Dapčević's file, by his own account, never closed on those terms. That puts Dapčević in a different category from many of the men described earlier in this account. The ones swept up largely on suspicion, for owning the wrong newspaper or saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment. Dapčević was not one of those. He held the beliefs the camp existed to punish, held them before his arrest, and held them by his own account all the way through 6 years designed specifically to make him stop. Whatever else can be said about the system running Goli Otok, it did not fail to identify a genuine believer when it caught one. It simply could not do anything to change what he believed once it had him. Whether Dapčević spent time specifically inside Petrova Rupa, the isolation section built for exactly the kind of prisoner the camp considered too resistant for the general population, is not confirmed in the sources available for this account. The record does not say. What can be said is that his profile matches the section's stated purpose almost exactly. A high-ranking Cominformist who never recanted, held for years rather than months, whether he passed through that particular pit or simply endured conditions close enough to it inside the general camp, is one detail this story cannot close cleanly. Nobody wrote it down in a way that survivors or historians could later confirm. Here's the detail that makes his 6 years on the island harder to file away neatly. In January 1953, while Vlado was somewhere in that system of camps, his brother Peko was named chief of the Yugoslav General Staff, the most senior military position in the entire country, answering directly to Tito. For most of that year, one Dapčević brother held one of the highest offices in Yugoslavia, while the other stood in roll call before dawn on a barren island. And nothing in the surviving record suggests the first fact did anything at all to change the second. It did not. Which is to say, whatever the Dapčević name was worth inside the party, it was not worth enough to get a Cominformist brother off Goli Otok early. Not in 1953. That would come later, and for a much narrower reason. By the time his sentence reached its end on the mainland camp system in December 1956, Dapčević had served 8 years against an original term of 20. What his file listed as release did not amount to freedom in any ordinary sense. He returned to civilian life under close police surveillance, watched carefully enough that the government still clearly considered him a live problem rather than a closed one. That was 1956. The system was not finished with him yet. 2 years later, in 1958, Dapčević left Yugoslavia entirely, crossing into Albania with a group of fellow exiles, and moving on from there into the Soviet Union within months. A striking destination for a man Tito's government had spent 6 years on Goli Otok trying to break up exactly those loyalties. He would not stay there permanently. By 1967, shifts inside Soviet politics pushed him out of the USSR as well, and he relocated again, this time to Western Europe, where for close to a decade he lived as a political exile rather than a prisoner, still committed to the same politics that had already cost him 8 years of his life once. If there is a prison or a penal colony you think belongs on this channel, the comments are read. Nobody watching him settle into that exile in the late 1960s could have guessed what Yugoslavia still had planned for him, or how the Dapčević name would matter again, this time in his favor. That part of the story comes later, after the island itself changed and stopped being a political prison at all. Stalin died on the 5th of March, 1953. The reason Goli Otok existed in the first place began to lose its footing almost immediately. Within 2 years, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union were talking again. Nikita Khrushchev flew to Belgrade in 1955 and, in front of the world's press, apologized for the treatment Yugoslavia had received under Stalin. The following February, back in Moscow, Khrushchev went further still, delivering a speech to the Soviet Communist Party that denounced Stalin's own crimes in terms no Soviet leader had used in public before. By then, the entire justification for Goli Otok, the danger posed by Soviet loyalists inside Yugoslavia, was coming apart at both ends at once. Moscow was apologizing to Belgrade, and Moscow's own new leadership was disowning the man Goli Otok's prisoners had supposedly been too loyal to. By 1956, the political camp was wound down. Most of the men still classified as Cominformists were released over the course of that year, Dapčević among them in December. On paper, this looked like the kind of ending this channel has described before. A scandal, an inspection, a photograph that finally forced a government's hand. It was not that kind of ending. There was no press expose, no commission that found the camp unfit for use. The political justification simply expired quietly once the country it had been built to defend against stopped being hostile. Nobody involved in building the system paid a price for it that year or for a decade afterward. Aleksandar Ranković, the interior minister who had turned the isolation concept into an actual camp, the man whose secret police ran every hierarchy inside it, kept his position at the top of Yugoslav security for another 10 years. When he finally fell in July 1966, it had nothing to do with Goli Otok. He was removed for wiretapping Tito's own home, a scandal about spying on his colleagues rather than anything done to the thousands of men who had passed through the island under his authority. The only fall from power connected to this story was never about the island at all. What did not end in 1956 was the island itself. The camp shifted toward holding ordinary criminal prisoners rather than political ones, a change in purpose more than a change in operation. And it would continue functioning under that new label for another 3 decades. The men sent there under the new label were no longer classified as enemies of the state. Many were ordinary criminal offenders serving sentences that had nothing to do with Cominform politics at all, run through the same barracks and the same quarry, under an administration that no longer needed to justify itself in ideological terms. Only in terms of cost, same as before, but now without even the pretense of correcting anyone's political loyalty. Here's the part that has never been settled and probably will not be. Figures compiled by historians working from surviving camp records put the number of deaths at Goli Otok during the political period at somewhere between 287 and 600, out of roughly 13,000 people who passed through the camp between 1949 and 1956. Figures drawn from survivor testimony instead of camp paperwork run far higher, in some accounts approaching 4,000. That is not a rounding error. That is a gap of more than 3,000 people in a country that controlled every document capable of closing it. Nobody wrote that down in a form anyone can check today, not because the truth was unknowable at the time. Someone, somewhere, kept a ledger of who arrived and who did not leave, but because the country that ran the camp had no incentive to publish a number it could not control, and the survivors who lived to describe what they saw had no ledger of their own, only memory, and the men they watched disappear. Both figures have been repeated often enough by different people with different reasons for the number they prefer that the gap between them has become almost as much a part of the island's history as anything that happened inside its fences, which is to say, the same system that made a man responsible for what happened to the prisoner in the next bunk also made sure that, decades later, nobody could say with certainty how many of those men never left. By then, even the fact of the camp's existence had spent decades under a kind of managed silence. Yugoslav newspapers never covered Goli Otok while it operated, and for years afterward the subject stayed effectively unpublishable. Dragoslav Mihailovic's 1968 novel on the camp was banned within months, and other writers who tried the same subject in the years that followed generally fared no better. It was only after Tito's death in 1980 that the topic moved gradually into open discussion inside Yugoslavia at all. A country that had run a secret island prison for the better part of 4 decades spent most of that same period making sure its own citizens could not read about it. Goli Otok closed for good on the 30th of December, 1988. By then it had been operating as an ordinary prison for longer than it had ever operated as a political one. 32 years under the second label, against 6 under the first. The island did not close because anyone in Belgrade decided the history attached to it had become a problem. It closed the way most old institutions close, because the buildings were aging, because the isolation that had once been the whole point was by the late 1980s simply an expensive way to run a prison. What every man who left the camp during its political years carried with him was not written into any museum plaque. On release, a prisoner signed a document. Inside the system, it was referred to plainly as the commitment, promising never to discuss what he had seen on the island and agreeing to report on the people he encountered afterward, particularly other former prisoners. Declining to sign one was not, in any practical sense, a choice available to him. Silence was not a side effect of leaving Goli Otok. It was the last condition the system attached to a man before it let him go, and it followed him for the rest of his life, whether or not anyone ever checked that he was keeping it. The logic did not change when a man walked out the gate. Inside the camp, the boycott had worked by making isolation and denunciation more attractive than solidarity. Outside it, the commitment ran on the same principle at national scale. A government that had learned, on a 4.5 square kilometer island, exactly how well that combination worked, and saw no reason to retire it once the boat ride home was over. Life after release rarely returned to what it had been before arrest. Former prisoners commonly faced open discrimination in hiring, exclusion from professions they had trained for, and a kind of social quarantine that outlived the sentence itself, a milder version of the boycott that had once operated inside the camp, now applied by neighbors and employers who knew, or half knew, where a man had spent several years of his life. The commitment did not need to be enforced by police alone. A society already primed to treat a former Cominformist as suspect did a great deal of that enforcement on its own. Vlado Dapčević had already lived through all of that once. The sentence, the camp, the release that was not quite release. By the late 1960s, he was in Western Europe, an exile rather than a prisoner, and for close to a decade he stayed there, still arguing the same politics that had cost him 8 years the first time. Nobody watching him in that period had reason to think Yugoslavia still considered his case open. It did. In 1975, while Dapčević was visiting Bucharest, Romanian and Yugoslav intelligence services jointly organized his abduction, seizing him inside a country he had entered as an exile with no reason to expect arrest, and delivering him back across the border to face the government he had spent 17 years avoiding. There was no extradition hearing, no public legal process that a lawyer from either country could have observed. Somebody decided that, and he was never anywhere near the place when it happened. Yugoslavia tried him again on the strength of the old case, and this time the government did not settle for 20 years. He was sentenced to death in absentia, a formality since by then he was very much in Yugoslav custody, not absent from anywhere. The sentence was commuted to 20 years of hard labor. The stated reason was Peko Dapčević's standing as one of the most decorated commanders in the country's history. The same family name that had done nothing to shorten Vlado's 6 years on Goli Otok in the 1950s was, 20 years later, the reason he did not die for the same politics a second time. Which is to say, whatever protection the Dapčević name carried inside Yugoslavia, it had a price the system was willing to pay only once the alternative was a body instead of a sentence. Dapčević served the new term at Požarevac prison and was released in 1988. The same year the island that had defined the first act of his adult life finally shut its gates for good. Release again did not mean he was free to stay. Yugoslavia expelled him the moment he walked out. He was permitted to return only in 1990, as the country that had imprisoned him twice was itself beginning to come apart. He spent his remaining years opposing the war in the Balkans and, later, the government of Slobodan Milosevic, founding a small political party in 1992 built on the same convictions that had sent him to Goli Otok in the first place 44 years earlier. There's a great deal more of this list left to get through, and new islands go up on this channel on a regular schedule. 2 sentences, 40 years apart, for the same set of beliefs. One nearly killed him slowly, on an island with no water and a wind that could knock a man down. The other very nearly killed him outright, and was stopped only by an accident of birth he had no more control over than he had over the weather on Goli Otok. Nobody has lived on Goli Otok since 1989. The buildings the prisoners themselves built, the barracks, the administration block, the workshops that once produced tile and furniture for the mainland, are still standing in varying states of collapse, roofless in places, stripped of anything worth carrying away decades ago. Nobody has repaired any of it. Sheep graze on what used to be the exercise yards, brought over by herders from the island of Rab, who lease the grazing rights. Tourists arrive by boat in the summer months, walk the same path from the dock that new prisoners once walked through a line of screaming men, and take photographs of a quarry face that 13,000 people once cut by hand. Nothing on the island explains on its own what any of it was for. Part of what is missing from that walk is a whole second camp that operated at the same time on a different island for a different population. Sveti Grgur, a short distance from Goli Otok, held the system's female prisoners under the same boycott structure applied to the men. Exactly how long it operated is a question the sources do not agree on, and this account will not pretend otherwise. One historian's figures put the women's section at roughly a single year, 1951 to 1952. A memorial research project that later tried to document every woman held there by name uses a window of 1950 to 1956 instead, matching the men's camp more closely. A separate general reference gives a span running into 1980, 3 credible-looking sources, 3 different answers, and nothing available for this account resolves which one is correct. What is not in dispute is the scale, and how invisible that scale stayed for decades. That same memorial project, launched in 2017 by an anthropologist, an artist, and a psychotherapist entitled 850 Women for 850 Women, found records for more than 862 women held across Goli Otok and Sveti Grgur combined, and settled on 850 as a working number specifically because nobody before them had bothered to count with any precision at all. The project's method was not a documentary or a book. It was terracotta, workshops in which participants shaped a small sculpture for each woman, one at a time, because the historical record had never given most of them so much as a name attached to a face. A 2024 film out of Montenegro, built around surviving testimony, carried that same recovery to a wider audience. Not everyone got a film. In July 2019, survivors and relatives gathered on the island itself for a memorial ceremony, one of the more visible public acknowledgments the site has received since it closed. Nothing about that ceremony changed Montenegro's position on compensation. Nothing about it added a confirmed name to either side of the gap between 287 and 4,000. Most of the republics that once made up Yugoslavia have, since independence, formally recognized what happened at Goli Otok, extended some form of legal rehabilitation to the people sent there, and in a number of cases paid compensation to survivors or their families. As of the most recent reporting available, Montenegro has not. No formal government acknowledgement, no rehabilitation process, no compensation. For a country whose own citizens, including a lieutenant colonel with a decorated brother, were sent to the island in significant numbers. Whatever the political reasons for that gap, no comparable gap exists among most of the other republics that shared the same history. Vlado Dapčević did not live to see the end of that particular gap, if it ever closes. He died in Brussels on the 12th of July, 2001, having spent his final years opposing the war that tore Yugoslavia apart, and afterward, the government of Slobodan Milosevic, the same instinct toward the losing, unpopular side of an argument that had defined his politics since 1948. He was permitted to return to the country that had imprisoned him twice, only a year before it stopped being the country he had been imprisoned by at all. Goli Otok is a nature reserve today, administered by the local county rather than any national body devoted to memory or justice. There is no museum on the island itself. What remains is the stone, the wire, most of it rusted through, and a silence that this time has nothing enforcing it. No commitment, no camp administration, no boycott. Just an absence of anyone left to ask. We go inside the places empires built beyond their own borders, one island at a time. And the empires built a great many of them,